Hey guys, welcome back. No doubt you have been to the inner sanctum atop Hyrule Castle. It's a cool place with some royal guard weapons around, sconces you can light, and of course, a hidden secret. Aside from all that, there is this really obvious thing in the center of the room, the entrance to the Astral Observatory. Of course, we all know that the observatory was the site of the big final battle in Breath of the Wild. And so, imagine how strange it is to come back here 6 or so years later, to find it completely filled in. Why did the Hylians do this? By itself, it doesn't seem like the Astral Observatory was a threat. How did they do this? The Astral Observatory was huge, and this is filled to the rim. And what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, that's today's topic. So kick back and relax while I walk you through it. Let's talk about the Astral Observatory in Tears of the Kingdom. Part 1. What is the Astral Observatory? To start this off, I want to talk about what the Astral Observatory is. This relates to past theories I've done, mainly covered by my mystery videos, but I'll cover the details here. The Astral Observatory is a structure that was built into the Hyrule Pillar, as I call it. A spike of stone that goes down a staggering negative 1,300 meters below ground, right above the imprisoning chamber. That would mean that this pillar is over a kilometer tall, all with a sizable chunk of the castle built on top of it. Think about that for a moment. Anyhow, thanks to the work done by Monster Maze, we know that the internal file name calls the spike a Purification Unit, though that may just be the name of the device on the tip. Previously, I speculated, as he did a month or so later, that this spike was absorbing the purified darkness from the Demon King. It is my belief that this spike transferred the power up to the Astral Observatory, which was built around the same time as the castle's construction. The Astral Observatory served a few important functions, be it from tracking key star locations, to including a 130-degree layout of the land from this point of view. My speculation is that the biggest function would be routing power through the whole Sheikah network, which includes the massive pillars, the towers, the shrines, the furnaces, the divine beast, etc. All that power was pulled directly from the purified energy from the Demon King, and thus, ultimately the man was being used as fuel. In order to build the Astral Observatory, they had to burrow into this huge spike, hollowing out a massive chamber, and I do mean massive. Just wait till you see the math. Thanks to the bit of wall that we see of the Astral Observatory in the library's secret passage, I have measured out exactly how big this would be. Though that wall in Tears of the Kingdom is now stone that is strangely unclimbable. How that came about is a topic for another day. I won't bore you with all the math to solve this, but here are my findings if you want to see them. You math guys can pause the videos if you want to double check my work, but it's not my goal to become a heavy math channel. The important takeaway here is that the total space of the observatory itself is about 46,000 cubic meters. Needless to say, that is a lot of space, which makes sense given that the final battle took place here. It could very well be that this chamber is basically responsible for the functioning of all Sheikah technology. It is worth noting that at the start of Breath of the Wild, the castle only lit up after the first tower was activated on the Great Plateau, and it is very possible that a signal was sent to the observatory from there, then relayed out through the network to activate everything else. It is impressive technology, which makes it a shame that they abandoned it and filled the hole in with dirt. Clearly, after the events of the Calamity and the near collapse of the kingdom, there was fear of the machines. Nobody would blame them for wanting to turn them off and never using them again. These are simple people who want simple lives, and there is nothing wrong with that. Clearly, they filled this hole to prevent anybody from accessing the main unit. But it is an absurd amount of space to fill. How did they do it? To find out how, let's talk about Lake Mave. Before we move on to that though, are you enjoying the video? If so, would you please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future content? I put out a video every week, and the channel needs growth for it to continue. Anyhow, enough of the YouTube stuff. Let's move on. Part 2. How they filled it. In my recent Lake Mabe video, I presented the idea that the lake was dug to harvest dirt to fill this hole. For those of you unaware, Lake Mabe is east of Hyrule Castle by Mabe Prairie and did not exist in Breath of the Wild. And yes, I am calling it Mabe now. But thank you for everybody who pointed out in that video that I should be using the Japanese pronunciation. Anyhow, this is the lake that Link and Zelda fell into during the ending. And so my conclusion was that this is a new lake made by the Hylians within the last 6 or so years. I believe that carts of dirt were hauled along the road, through Castle Town, and up through the guardhouses into the inner sanctum. In the comments to that video, I was challenged on this concept. First, about how much dirt it would take to do the task, how many carts would be needed, and if a horse could pull those wagons there. After those comments, I felt compelled to do the math. And so here is a brief overview of the math behind it. First, the standard cargo wagon we see in the game won't work for this as they are simply too small. Their measurements are 3 by 4 by 2 meters and would carry a total of 24 cubic meters of material. It seems reasonable to suggest that Hudson Company could create a more sturdy wagon for this job. Using blocks from the fittingly named Building Blocks Shrine in the Forgotten Temple, I was able to create 2 configurations, with the base cube of each of these blocks being exactly 2 by 2 meters. I was able to create what I am calling a large wagon, which is 6 by 4 by 2 meters, and would carry 48 cubic meters of matter. I also created what I am calling an industrial wagon, which is 6 by 4 by 4 meters, and would carry 96 cubic meters of material. You can see how the math doubles the amount each time, and that the large and industrial wagons are solid stone. These stones are heavy too. Not even a hover stone can keep them floating. Now, I need to be clear that gluing these onto a wagon isn't exactly ideal. It's pretty unstable. A custom wagon would fix these problems, I imagine. The large wagon is stable enough that I can just glue the stone onto it without it falling over. The industrial wagon unfortunately falls over for reasons I don't completely understand, and so I've had to use a zonai stabilizer with it. I know it's not ideal, and that the Hylians wouldn't have had access to zonai devices. But let's just assume that Hudson's company could make a more stable wagon large enough for this. Trust me, this won't matter in the long run for reasons you will see later. Here are some footage of both trips from Lake Mabe to Hyrule Castle's first gate, a lot of which in the castle is uphill. You can see, despite the heavy weight of the load, that the horse is able to pull it. This isn't a special horse either, just one that I caught in Breath of the Wild and carried over into Tears of the Kingdom. And in case you're wondering, his name is Bidvet. Speaking of which, it's worthwhile to bring up that Hylians may have had help from the Sheikah horse armor, which gives some enhancements to the steed. At least the set that Link finds in Breath of the Wild does. Look at those glowing blue spurs. Anyhow, the important part is that a large wagon is able to make the trip without any stabilizers. The industrial wagon is able to make the trip as well, but with a stabilizer. Considering we know the total area of the Astral Observatory, which again is 46,000 cubic meters, we can now determine the number of loads of dirt that would need to be hauled to fill it. For a large wagon which carries 48 cubic meters, it would take 9,567 loads. If we assume 6 trips are being done per day, that comes to 1,594 days, or about 4.4 years of labor. Well, Earth years at least. We don't know how many days are in a Hyrulean year, but let's just assume 365, like we have here on Earth, for this scenario. That's doable within the time frame between games. Now for the big boy, the industrial wagon, which carries 96 cubic meters. It would take 4,792 trips. If we again assume 6 trips per day, that comes down to 799 days, about 2.2 years of labor. If they were running multiple wagons, it could be done faster. Okay, so we have our numbers. Let's talk about the implications of this. Is this feasible? In my opinion, yes. They could have crews of people, soldiers and workers, digging and preparing carts to move the dirt. Depending on how the wagons were made, dumping the dirt into the hole could be easy. And if you need evidence that a horse could casually walk to the sanctum, here is some footage of me doing just that in Breath of the Wild on my horse midnight. I clearly cannot repeat this trip in Tears of the Kingdom, since the castle has been ripped in half due to the upheaval. Some might raise objections and say that the horse isn't strong enough to carry that much weight. Well, I have this footage of a horse doing just that, and this is solid stone being carried. I realize that this is a game mechanic and possibly an oversight. But let's consider that Hyrule is a world of fantasy and magic, so these horses may be stronger than the ones that we have in the real world. And that is before consulting a certain horse fairy that may or may not eat people. The jury is still out on that. Another thing to consider is that in our real world, it isn't uncommon to see multiple horses banded together to haul heavy loads. So 2 horses, or even 4 horses, could pull this much weight. Ultimately, this seems feasible, and over the course of 2.5 or even 3 years, the Astral Observatory could be filled with dirt. Now for the next complication. The fact that Lake Mabe simply doesn't have enough dirt to facilitate completely filling it. Part 3. Digging the Lake. Before I get into it, I need to clarify something about the Lake Mabe video. I speculated that there was a hole going into the depths filled with water at this location, as well as at the bottomless pond. After measuring these holes with the same cubes I used for the wagon, I can confirm that they do have a bottom. The deepest part of Lake Mabe is 8 meters, and the bottomless pond is somewhat embarrassingly only 6 meters deep. I was expecting a lot more. Anyhow, I wanted to figure out about how much dirt there was from Lake Mabe missing from Breath of the Wild. I'll spare all the heavy calculations. Here is another picture if you math guys want to double check my work. Ultimately, taking into account that these 2 triangles were raised because of the hillside, and being overly generous with how deep the shore is, I determined the amount of material taken from the lake was under 155,136 cubic meters. And now that we have that number, let's run the numbers on the wagons with this new metric in mind. For a large wagon hauling 48 cubic meters, it would take 3,232 trips. If we assume 6 trips a day, that comes out to about 540 days, or 1.5 years. For an industrial wagon hauling 96 cubic meters, it would take 1,616 trips. If we again assume 6 trips per day, that would be about 270 days, or about 9 months. With that in mind, the idea of digging Lake Mabe seems extremely likely. We could even throw in the moats at Lookout Landing, which I didn't measure. While this all seems like good news for my theory, some of you have probably realized that it isn't, because even with the high estimate I provide for that dirt, it would only fill up the Astral Observatory to just over 33%. As you can see, the Astral Observatory would need a lot more dirt to fill it, about 300,000 cubic meters, which then raises the question, where did all of this dirt come from? It is here that we have to ask a serious question regarding the intent of the creators. Am I on the right track here? When they chose to make this visual of the Astral Observatory being filled in, and created a new lake nearby, were they really thinking that the Hylians filled the observatory with that dirt? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. We can't be sure. For the moment, let's assume that they did. If they did, we have to ask if they really sat down and did the level of insane calculations I am doing to accommodate the thought. Meticulously plot out the size of the lake in order to come up with the volume of matter to justify preventing us from entering the observatory. Or if they did think that the lake was dug to fill this place, Does it seem more likely that they just hand-waved it and thought that there would be enough without running any of the numbers? If you ask me, in such a situation, they would have made the assumption that there was enough dirt and didn't look back. Even if that is the case, I am still bothered that this is not adding up. I mean, I basically hate doing math like this, and I was really hoping that it would line up correctly. It was at this point I was a bit stumped. Unless I assumed that the team didn't run the numbers, I felt as though my theory had been busted, and so I started talking to the community about it. A few things came up to me, which is, if we look at the whole, there is more than dirt in it. There is rubble, and all seemed to be from Hylian stonework, and so I went and checked. It would seem that there was a lot more in this hole than dirt. There is rubble from broken settlements and likely pieces of the castle. It then became clear exactly what they had done. They had turned the Astral Observatory into the Astral Landfill. Part 4. The Astral Landfill. I was saving this for another video, but here it is. I think the mass disappearance of Sheikah technology was them messing around with the control unit in the observatory and sending out a mass signal to dematerialize various pieces of the Sheikah tech. They would start with the obvious threats, like any guardian that was still active. Once those machines were disposed of, they would move up removing other undesirable things. I will touch more on how they did this and why when I flesh out that theory more. For now, let's assume that all of these Guardian husks we see across the land were unable to be decompiled like active pieces of technology. As such, they would remain as huge pieces of litter all across the kingdom, from the plateau to the citadel, Hateno Field, and so forth. They are missing in tiers of the kingdom except for one that is kept atop the Hateno Tech Lab. So, what happened to all of these broken pieces? I propose that they were dragged up to Hyrule Castle and chucked into the Astral Observatory. I know that some of you might question if the Astral Observatory is actually filled with debris, perhaps thinking that it was just capped off to prevent entry. I, however, can prove that it is completely filled. Here is some footage of me ascending through the Hyrule Pillar, through where the Astral Observatory would have been. If there was open space there, Link would have appeared inside of it. And while I personally would have found that fascinating and wonderful, it simply isn't the case. The place seems to be filled with something, and so let's speculate. I propose that they would have started with Guardian Husk, and whatever else might have been even remotely dangerous. Once those were disposed of, they would move on to rubble and start to dig the lake. Finally, they would fill the last part in, and then maybe consider moving on to castle repairs. 6 or so years would pass while this whole process was happening, enough time for new life to be born in the kingdom, and for children to ignore the tales of their parents about the killer machines that once stalked the fields. All that time, under their feet, they would be completely in the dark about what was building. I think this is a sad fate for the Astral Observatory. It was an impressive feat of technology, the cornerstone of the wonders of the Sheikah, to be used as a landfill for machines that nearly destroyed the kingdom, filled with the rubble of the settlements that those machines broke, and finally topped off with dirt from the new lake. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom pull much inspiration from the Studio Ghibli films, works that showcase the horrors of the past, advances in technology, and the horrors that it wreaks on the land. These films often echo Shintoism and idolize living simple lives in harmony with nature, to bury the past and start new, fresh and pure. Perhaps now that the Demon King has been dealt with, they will be able to do just that. Thank you for watching the video. If you haven't done so already, a like and subscribe go a long ways. I put out a video every week and work really hard to meet that schedule. For those of you who have a little more, maybe consider joining my Patreon or becoming a channel member. If you do so, I will give you a shout out in my next video, as well as your name being displayed with the rest of these people down here. In addition, you'll gain access to my Discord where we can talk more directly. I love talking about Zelda stuff, and I can get really chatty at night. If you're one of those people who likes to engage in comment discussions down below, maybe consider joining so we can talk more directly on Discord. Well, that's all I have for you today, guys. Be safe, and may the way of the hero lead to the Triforce.